Welcome to Hot Media, episode 311, entitled The History of TV Part 2. Now, I realize that in doing a monologue about the history of television, I am really biting off much more than I can chew as a single person. As a matter of fact, if you want to see a great documentary series with a lot of clips and interviews and background, please check out CNN's History of the Sitcom. Our good friend Bill Carter, the former TV critic for the New York Times, who's been a guest here on Hot Media. Bill was one of the executive producers on that, and that's a very thorough history. But what I'm doing here during the holiday period, as we get ready to wrap up 2021, I'm doing a number of monologues related to some of the courses I teach at Caldwell University. And one of my favorites is TV show genres. Last week, actually 2 weeks ago, we took off for Thanksgiving, of course, as we do every year. But on the last episode of the program, what I did was to talk pretty much only about talk shows. There's so much about every single genre. That's why this course has been so fascinating. But today we're going to quickly go through the situation comedy, the TV news magazine show, and its cousin, documentaries, and also talk a little bit about sports, giving very short shrift, I'm sorry, to reality. Now, reality TV is something that I thought, this just shows how much I know, that it was something that would come and go. It really hit big in 2000 on CBS with Survivor, which of course is still on now. They do about 3 seasons per year, so they're like in season 50 or something ridiculous like that. Nonetheless, the situation is that it seemed to be only a fill-in for the summertime. And then Survivor just caught on like wildfire. And of course, the network said, there's money in this. This is not just a cheap summer replacement. What was happening was that broadcast television, even 21 years ago, knew that it was having trouble competing with the quality of cable TV. And cable TV with HBO and Showtime, they premium networks, as they call them, the premium networks were running very high quality, what is called prestige drama. As a result of that, they could run at any time of year. They would run a show like 6 Feet Under in the summertime. And every September, that the broadcast networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, and Fox, would come back for a new season in September, which used to be such a big deal, the new season. Well, who cared anymore? You had the TV you wanted year round. So that was the situation. And CBS realized they had to have something else on in the summer. So they knew that reality TV is so much cheaper to produce. You don't have to hire actors. Granted, some of the stuff is scripted, but these are technically real people. And it was really interesting who they tapped to do it. Mark Burnett, who, yes, did bring us Donald Trump, thanks to The Apprentice and The Celebrity Apprentice, made him much more of a national television personality than he already was. He was very well known here in the tri-state area, but not around the rest of the country to such a great extent. But Mark Burnett had been in British special services in the military, kind of like our version of the Army Rangers here in the U.S. He was somebody who knew how to survive, somebody knew how to live off the land, fend for himself. And when he went to Hollywood to try to make it in show business and media, he got jobs as a nanny and as a chauffeur so he could meet the right people. Well, it all worked out that all of his background worked perfectly to create and produce Survivor. It became a huge hit, but actually there was a reality TV show before that, back in 1992, called The Real World on MTV, but Survivor is really seen as the jumping off point. I had a student who did an oral report in TV show genres on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and she made a really good point. I was mocking it and, because I don't like reality TV, writing it off as trash. And she pointed out some of the issues that are involved in it, and it's schmaltzy and it's over the top, but it actually did make me think twice about even something like the Kardashians. So that's reality TV in a nutshell. It starts with Survivor in 2000, big time. It starts with Mark Burnett, and it never stopped. And the students, people ages 18 to 22, This is when they really come alive. This is what a lot of them really know and what they still watch television for. They might not be watching television the rest of the time for their entertainment or their information. So, my favorite, of course, is sitcoms. And as I said, you can get a lot more from Bill Carter's series on CNN. It's at least an 8-part series, and it looks at all different aspects of the sitcom from a sociological point of view, a business point of view, an artistic point of view. But the situation comedy is one of these TV genres that came from radio. Burns and Allen, Jack Benny, they all just transitioned. And the reason that all of this happened, that so many genres just came over from radio, is that the first TV companies, and still the biggest TV companies, were the radio companies, CBS, NBC, and to a lesser extent back then, ABC, which was spun off from NBC because it was considered to be a monopolistic practice, the way that NBC had two different networks back in those days of radio. So that's how situation comedies start. And then comes the 1950s with something that was called the subgenre of Hi, Honey, I'm Home. It was white, upper middle class, men in suits, women in dresses, everything perfect. All the children were perfect. And of course, so many of the plot lines were not funny, even by those standards in those days. Everything was cautious. Everything was careful. Everything was pure for the sponsors, for the FCC, for the network affiliates around the country, many of whom those TV stations are independently owned. And in the 1960s, the genre, with the exception of some great shows such as The Mary Tyler Moore Show, it got into what was called the stupid sitcom or the silly sitcom. My Favorite Martian, My Mother the Car, and of course, Gilligan's Island. There were some bright spots in the 50s too. Of course, the great Lucille Ball, the great Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz is the one who created the modern three-camera sitcom shot in front of a live audience. They didn't really know how to do situation comedy from a production standpoint before Desi Arnaz, as a producer, created that concept. And of course, with New Year's coming and marathons, that Jackie Gleason did The Honeymooners, 39 episodes as a sitcom. It mainly lived on his variety show as a recurring skit. But when you get into the 1970s, you get to Norman Lear, and Norman Lear changes everything. Norman Lear doesn't just change the medium of television. He doesn't just change the genre of the sitcom. What he does is to really change American society. There were other chances for networks to give Norman Lear's All in the Family an opportunity. In 1968, ABC passed on it, and they were very upset that they did. But America may not have been ready for Archie Bunker in 1968. And in 1971, it premiered on CBS. It didn't get big ratings at first, but it got so much critical acclaim and it won so many Emmys that people could not ignore All in the Family and Archie Bunker dealing with issues. Well, Archie wasn't dealing with it. He was the problem. And of course, that was the source of the humor. It is satire. Satire which may not actually pass today's test of being offensive, even if it is meant to mock, using satire, things such as racism and sexism and the war in Vietnam and things of that nature. But Norman Lear's formula certainly worked. People wanted the tension to be laughed at. They wanted the bigotry to be mocked in All in the Family, and then in Sanford and Son, and then in Maude. And it's interesting about Maude because with the Mississippi case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court now, which may overturn Roe v. Wade, or at least certainly weaken it, you had a situation in which in 1972, Maude gets an abortion on network TV in a situation comedy. So situation comedy, thanks to Norman Lear, became social and political in the 70s. But the flip to that is Gary Marshall. Late in the 1970s, he said that television is very important. And just the way that school is very important, prestige television, Norman Lear television. He said, I do Recess. And he created escapist shows about an earlier time. And when people are nostalgic for a Gary Marshall show, it's actually nostalgia for nostalgia, because in the late 1970s, he's talking about romantically the age of the early 1960s with Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, etc. So that's the situation that brought the 1970s to a close. As you get into the 1980s, you get much more the workplace family. You get people who are not biologically related. They're not the nuclear family that we knew in the 1950 sitcoms, the Hi, Honey, I'm Home sitcoms. But what you had was a family at work in a taxi garage, or a family that all were the people who hung out in a bar in Boston in Cheers. You had a taste of it in the 70s with Mary Tyler Moore, a very sophisticated show of the 70s in which you really did have a workplace family. And then in the late 1980s, a different trend came in, taking a single stand up comedian, two of whom were the biggest names of the day. And both of these people are now pretty much canceled in our current culture. And that's not the subject of what I'm talking about here. I'm just talking about the history of the sitcom. But Bill Cosby and Roseanne Barr were at the time, regardless of what has happened subsequently, the biggest stand up comedians at the time. And Tom Werner and Morrissey Carsey were a producing team, and together they would build a show and a series completely around the persona of a stand-up comedian, which is exactly what they did, and it also worked with Tim Allen in Home Improvement. The 90s, of course, brought Friends and Seinfeld. And again, it switches from being the workplace family, but it's still not a nuclear family. It's the network of friends, whether they're hanging around and it's a show about nothing, or if they're young and upcoming and trying to find themselves and find their lives. That's what the situation comedy was in those days. The three camera live audience situation comedy is dying out now. Everybody Loves Raymond made it from the 90s into the 21st century with that production formula. And shows like Two and a Half Men with from producer Chuck Lorre and The Big Bang Theory, also a Lorre show, use the old Desi Arnaz production formula. But starting with The Office, the American version of The Office, originally a British show, and then moving on to Modern Family, the single camera situation comedy became the standard. There was no audience. There is no laugh track. There is simply a single camera shot, very much like a movie, very much like a dramatic television show. And sometimes they use the mockumentary form that, well, why is there a camera in there? Well, because they're doing a documentary. And sometimes it's just what they call the omniscient third person. We just are the camera and we know what is going on in these people's lives. And that has worked with many comedies, including Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm on HBO, even though when he did Seinfeld, that was a three-camera live audience situation comedy. But the sitcom can be stupid or the sitcom can be brilliant. The sitcom can be meaningless, and it can be, as Gary Marshall said, recess, or it can be something worthy of being called legitimate literary satire. And let's talk a little bit about the TV news magazine show. It's a very close cousin of the documentary, and documentaries are making a huge comeback now because of Netflix. One of the first great television documentaries was in 1960. It was Edward R. Murrow, and Murrow did a documentary about migrant workers called Harvest of Shame. Brilliant documentary, but it lasted for an hour. And one of the people who worked with Murrow was one of his proteges, one of his students, was Don Hewitt, a CBS News producer. And he said he loved documentaries, but documentaries kind of bored him. They got too much into the weeds. It was too much detail and too long. He wanted to make documentaries that were shorter, faster paced, and more entertaining. And so he created a whole new genre called the TV News Magazine Show. And the first one, and still the best one, and still the most successful one, is on the air in the 2020s, and that is called 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes began in 1968, and it lives on today. The pieces are about 13 minutes long. They're in depth, and sometimes they're deadly serious about issues such as gun control, and sometimes they're light celebrity profiles. But three segments in a single show, they all work extremely well together. There was a show, an episode of 60 Minutes just a couple of weeks ago, which I think embodies exactly what makes the show great. One piece done by Anderson Cooper was about fraternities and their alleged tolerance of hazing, and that leads very often to the death of college students. And he was very, very tough on a CEO of a national fraternity in terms of their alleged culpability in all of these hazing situations. And then there was a piece that was done by Leslie Stahl in which she went to Africa to show us the gorillas in the mist, the real gorillas in the mist. And then there was a piece done by Bill Whitaker about Rita Moreno, who has been around for many, many decades and is still one of the most fabulous stars in all of show business. And she's one of the few people in the world who is what is called an EGOT, an Emmy, an Oscar, a Grammy, and a Tony. So the celebrity profile, which had a lot of issues concerning social issues, sexual assault, racism, those were all in there while Bill Whitaker and Rita Moreno talked about her show business career. And the hazing story and the gorillas in the mist, each one was very different, but they all came together very well in 60 Minutes. Talk about 2020. 2020, of course, the name of another very successful TV magazine show. But 2020 and a lot of other shows like Dateline have really gone into what podcasts tend to be most successful at, and that is true crime, whereas 60 Minutes has stuck very much to the original mission. Finally, I want to talk about sports television. I'm going to be teaching a course at Caldwell University in the spring called Sports Media. Our good friend Malcolm Moran, who was a sports writer for the New York Times and now a professor of sports journalism in Indiana, he was talking on this very podcast, Hot Media, about the real conflict of interest, really, that exists for television networks. You don't get to cover the NFL. You can cover it, but you can't show their whole games without paying millions of dollars in contract fees. You can't broadcast the events of the Olympics without paying billions of dollars over the years for the rights to do that. But you also have to cover news that breaks at the Olympics in ways that may actually shed a bad light on your partner, the Olympic Committee, or the nation, in this case, Communist China, coming up with the Beijing Olympics, covering the host country and possible human rights abuses or political repression. So one of the things you really need to know most about the history of sports media is its development in terms of rights fees, really being what pays for MLB, even though they're in a lockout right now, the NFL, the NBA, and the National Hockey League, which just made a big deal with ESPN and Turner Sports. That is just the tip of the iceberg, but it gives me a chance to talk about it at the end of the semester. I don't teach that course in the spring. I do miss it until it comes around again the next year. So I thought I'd share some of it with you here. Next week, we go back to having the regular format of having guests. And Dan Casino's new book, we've been teasing this for a long, long time. Dan Casino's new book is going to be out, and we're going to be teasing that next week and talking about that. I'm going to have my friend Paul Levinson on here to talk about 2021, a year in review in terms of media. So we hope you join us. This is still primarily an audio podcast. And, we hope you subscribe on Spotify or Odyssey or Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to go. But also the video, we'd really like you to subscribe here on YouTube. And if you want to find out more about everything about Hot Media with Bob Mann, there's the website, www.bobmanhotmedia.com. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter, and my handle there is @BobMannMedia, BOBMANN Media. And on Instagram, it is BobMann92. And we hope that you join us on a regular basis here as we talk about the hottest content and the hottest controversies in mass media here on Hot Media. And we do have a couple of more shows that are coming up before we take a little break for Christmas and New Year's. And we thank you for joining us, and we hope you join us every week, and we hope you subscribe. Thank you so much for joining us right here on Hot Media and being a part of it.